Bonnie J. Skinner is a registered psychotherapist and executive coach with a laser focus on helping others overcome psychological obstacles to a prosperous and happy life. She believes in meeting people where they are and giving them real skills to get them to where they want to go. Bonnie, welcome to Elevating Women's Wellness. Thank you for being here.
Thank you so much for having me, Tara. It's just a pleasure.
So, tell us about yourself and how you became interested in psychology.
Oh, that's a good question. So I grew up originally in the East Coast. So I'm originally from Nova Scotia, and when I was I think it was grade 9, I had an opportunity to go to a camp in at Dalhousie University, and it was a medical based camp, and the one that I chose was about the brain and central nervous system. So when we were there, we actually got to handle the brains and learn about psychology. And that was really my first introduction to psychology and the mind and the brain. And I was instantly hooked. And everything from that moment onward was about me wanting to kind of figure things out and to understand our how we work, how our minds work, and what do we actually need to be healthy and strong mentally.
Yes, I think it's so fascinating. And I remember back to the first time that, working with human cadavers in the brain, it's just so fascinating to see that and recognize that that's within us. And then the mind aspect and how everything works. I think it's so fascinating. I love that you're doing this work too.
Mhm. Yeah, it's a pleasure to do it. And I mean, I had thought about kind of multiple streams. One of the streams that I wanted to go down was neurosurgery, and I'm like, maybe my attention span's not the doesn't wouldn't make me the greatest surgeon. So I found something that was a little bit more safer for my clients, and here I.
Amazing. So, who are the typical clients that you work with?
To be honest, we work with everybody. So we try to open ourselves up as a family practice. So we cover everything from moods and anxiety, depression, right down to family dynamics, conflicts, grief, loss. So what we try to do is we make sure that we have something, a program for everybody, or services that can kind of meet whatever the needs are.
So, it sounds like you have a pretty diverse clientele.
Absolutely.
So, specifically today, we're here to talk about guilt and shame. And I know
Mm.
this is a massive topic, but I would love to hear your insights on this. How are guilt and shame different?
Oh, that's a great question. What I typically say to my clients, I try to make it very simple, and it's that if each of the emotions were allowed to speak, guilt would say, I did something bad. Okay?
Mm,
And that's the feeling, like guilt comes up and we're like, oh, I did that, and I feel like I should never, I know that I should have. Shame is different. Shame is about the identity. So whereas guilt says, I did something bad, shame says, I am bad, right?
mm,
I am not worthy. So it's actually a judgment of the entire self instead of just an understanding or a judgment of the behavior. And
mhm.
shame has much heavier weight, right? Psychologically, it's much harder to dig at than
Mhm.
guilt.
So, what is their psychological impact on women? Specifically, if we could talk about guilt versus shame, what does the psychological impact look like?
Oh man, it can really do some damage. Like, you know, one of the things I or the ways in which I kind of conceptualize trying to treat somebody who's kind of steeped in shame is if you think about a new sapling, like say like a new maple sapling or just a new tree that's starting. If I wanted to go in and pull that tree out, probably not going to take me that much effort. But if I wanted to uproot a 200-year-old oak tree, I'm probably going to need a lot more effort and a lot more force because the roots of that tree are going to be so deep. They're going to infiltrate every possible area in every possible direction. And how that relates to shame is shame kind of does the same thing. So it's not just about the behavior. If it was about the behavior, I could change the behavior and kind of move on with my life. But those roots, those beliefs, they actually start to trickle into who we believe we are as a person,
Yeah.
what we believe about our value, what we believe about our ability to affect change, what we believe about our ability to have a good life. And so when those beliefs are go so deep into our psyche, it's very, very hard to uproot, right? If I'm guilty over behavior, I can go and I can apologize. Right? If I hurt my friend's feelings, yeah, I'm sorry, it's not what I meant. I can explain myself and I cannot do that again. And I don't need to question myself. But if I'm shameful, even if I don't repeat the behavior, I carry that pain, I carry that impact.
Yeah, I think that's such an apt analogy to explain the difference of the psychological impact.
Mhm.
It's really incredible how one is more, let's say, transient, superficial, easier to cope with, and more about behavior, and the other can be so deep rooted and really affect the person's entire being.
Absolutely. And I think, we think about it in terms of anything that affects who we feel we are also affects every other aspect of our life, right? So if
Mhm.
I feel like I'm unworthy or I feel like I'm a problem, it's going to show up in my relationships, it's going to show up in my intimate relationships, it's going to show up in my friendships, it's going to show up in my work, it's going to show up in my goals and my dreams, perhaps even in my parenting, right? And so with so much of that weight, it actually has the ability to change how we live our lives.
Mhm. So perhaps let's discuss first guilt, being that maybe it's about the behavior. How can we release guilt? How can we overcome that or heal when we're experiencing guilt?
You know, to reset how we think about guilt is to really think about what are our expectations. Right?
Mm.
So if, for example, let's say I am, I'm a new mom, right? And I make a mistake. The difference between me being guilty and me being shameful is going to be rooted in what I expected of myself as a mother. So if I'm coming out, I'm like, oh, I need to get this right. I need to not make a mistake. I need to know everything. I need, I need to make sure that my baby's okay 100% of the time and that nothing ever happens. When I set those expectations that are so broad, and I hate the word unrealistic, but they're not grounded in the actual likelihood, then what happens is as soon as I start to feel guilty, or sorry, what happens is when I do something that I'm like, oh, that wasn't the right decision. Now I have to go, okay, well, I shouldn't have done that. What's wrong with me? Instead of, oh, okay, I was bound to make a mistake. This is my first baby. This is my first child. I'm learning as I go. I'm not going to get it right. I'm going to make mistakes. Right. So yeah, I might still feel a little bit guilty that that my child was school without the right boots or something like that. But if that falls in a context where I'm allowing myself to make mistakes, I'm building in room for mistakes, then I'm more likely to feel guilt than I am shame.
Mhm. Mhm. Thank you for clarifying that. And
Mhm.
I'd like to hear more too about like where exactly does shame come from? What are the roots of that? How does it become a factor in our psychology?
Wow, that's a really great question. So, without giving like a whole neuroanatomy background, the easiest way to understand it is that when when we're born, from the time we're born, right, and when we go through our early years, children are very impulsive, right? Like children, if a child feels safe and secure, they will explore the world. They will touch things. They will taste things. They will try things. They will break things. That's a very natural state for a child. But obviously, that's going to cause some problems. So what has to happen is through the guidance they get from the adults in their life or in their world, they're learning about, okay, do this, don't do that. Touch this, don't touch that. Right? Say this, don't say that. If those lessons come in a way where it's taught about the behavior, okay? So the child's not shamed. The child is, oh, don't touch the stove because you're going to burn your fingers. We don't want to burn our fingers, do we? Right? So child goes, oh, yeah, that makes sense. Okay, not going to touch the stove. Now, if in the same scenario, the child's experience is the parent coming in and going, oh my God, what's wrong with you? You're so stupid. How could you do that? Oh my God, blah, blah, blah. And so what happens is the child's not receiving a message about the behavior.
Mhm.
They're receiving a message about themselves. Okay. Now, if that happens to an adult, right? Because sometimes we're not always kind to each other as adults. If it's an adult and I'm an adult and somebody's saying that to me, I can be like, wow, like you got an attitude problem. And I can probably like just fluff it off. But children don't often have the brain development and the age and stage they're at to be able to do that. So what children will actually do is they will internalize that message about themselves.
Mm.
And if they get that messaging consistently enough, child will start to believe that it's true. Oh, there's something wrong with me. I need to figure out what I'm supposed to be. And that creates an anxiety, whether it's in the conscious self or whether it's subconsciously. But then as that child moves through life as an adult, there's always this seed there that starts to grow, right? If you think of those childhood messages as seeds.
Mhm.
And if the seed of shame starts to grow and gets reinforced over time, and by reinforced, I mean you have more of those experiences, more of those messages internalized, then shame becomes a massive problem as an adult.
Yeah, it makes sense. I could see how that could take root in childhood and continue to grow and be reinforced by experiences.
Mhm.
So, if we're looking at an adult woman, what are the signs that she may be struggling with shame or guilt?
Mm. Good question. It I wouldn't say that it's necessarily uh generalized across the board, but one of the things, or a few of the things that we often see when somebody is guilt is or sorry is experiencing shame is there can be responses at either end of the spectrum. So I could be very defensive. I could, somebody gives me, maybe my employer gives me a critique, and it triggers that sense of shame, that like, oh yeah, I'm not good, this is proof, that kind of like, here's another person telling me how not good I am. But if I don't know how to process that, if I don't know how to manage that, I may come back swinging, right? I may come back and be mean or say something just because I feel so wounded, I feel so vulnerable. And so what we can often see with those who are experiencing shame is lashing out, right? Defensiveness. Shutting down is also a very common thing, right? Where there's sometimes when we're experiencing certain emotions, we have body postures that can reflect that emotion. So I see this in my practice all the time, is that when people are talking about things that make them feel shameful, there's a closed posturing that happens.
Mm.
So there's a head down kind of, you feel the shoulders come in, and this part of your body is closed. And that happens when we feel vulnerable. So that's another thing that you can experience. Now, on the flip side of that, if somebody is experiencing shame, but they know they have a shame trigger, they know they're vulnerable to shame, they may actually be able to respond and you not know that they felt shameful at all. Right? Shame is typically an emotion that we try to hide. So, they may come back and say, hey, I don't really understand what you're trying to communicate to me. I'm not sure I'm getting the message that you're trying to send. Can you say that again? Right. Now, maybe I feel super shameful inside, but if I know I have a shame trigger, then I know that I don't have to respond to that trigger. I can actually go back out into the world and get more information so that I can process what's happening.
Mhm. So the awareness piece is really important to know that. And if we have the awareness, we can take pause and have a different response.
The
Yeah.
another example might also be in the ways in which they manage conflict, right? And this is really even about gender, but if we are triggered into shame at any given point in time, depending upon our orientation to that, we may avoid conflict, right? We may try to conform, we may try to be what we're supposed to be. And I think in the women's world, we've talked for a very long time about the impact of all of the different messages coming from media, right? So, what size are you supposed to be? What's your hair supposed to look like? What are you supposed to wear? How high are your heels supposed to be? All of these things. How are you supposed to speak? What does it mean to be a lady? So there are all of these superficial identities that get imposed upon us. And if we don't already have a strong one, if we haven't already defined what womanhood is for us, then it means that we're more apt every time this a new identity gets pushed to go, oh God, is that what I'm supposed to be? Is that what I'm supposed to be? Is that so you can actually see in some cases people will follow different trends, right? Today they're wearing maxi dresses and flip-flops, right? Tomorrow it's business suits. And so there can often be this constant attempt to redefine oneself or to regroup because the self is kind of being questioned or not so stabilized because of the shame.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah, that absolutely makes sense. Now I know this is a huge question, but maybe I'll ask it in a more simple way. So,
Sure.
how do we heal from shame? What does that look like, or what are first
Mm,
steps as women that we could take in that direction?
that's a great question. One of the things that I do that my clients find very effective is we just write down the messages. So shame, every emotion we have has a voice, right? Like, anxiety's voice is like, what if, right?
Mhm.
Shame typically talks in statements. You are not good enough, right? You are stupid. You are lazy. You are this. So the first thing I typically invite my clients to do is let's just have the conversation with shame. What does shame say about you? Shame says I'm not pretty enough. Shame says I'm a terrible mother. Shame says everybody else is better than me. And then from there, we go to where did those messages come from?
Mhm.
When was the first time you remember feeling like you weren't good enough? And so, what we actually do is we start to tie the emotions, we start to tie the beliefs behind the emotions to the life experiences that likely generated or reinforced them. So, a lot of people will start to say, oh, no, I remember the first time I felt this feeling because shame is when it comes on, you know it, right? You don't have to figure out what it is. And they'll start to give me the experiences they've had, whether it is, I was in a relationship, and it doesn't always have to be childhood experiences. I think that's important to know too. If you're in an environment for long enough where the messages about you are consistent and consistently negative, it becomes very hard after a while not to internalize those messages and become shameful, right? So it's not always about what was in the past. So
Mhm.
I just say, where did those messages come from? What do you remember? And we start to talk instead about the experiences. And then the next step is to look at whether or not there's another way to understand those experiences. So, for example, let's say I'm sitting with a woman who's coming out of an abusive relationship, okay, and we're processing feelings of shame, feelings of all of that weight, and we go through it. We identify what it feels like. We identify the experiences. And now we're looking at the messages. One thing about shame is we're always in the middle. We are always the main character. Okay. So shame becomes about us. It's our fault. And so one of the questions I often ask is, how else could they have done that? If that person was upset with you, how else could they have let you know that they were upset? And you say, well, I don't know. Well, what would you have done? Okay, well, I would have left. I wouldn't have called names. Could they have left too if they really wanted to? Could they have? Yeah, they could have left. And so what happens is you start to take the responsibility for what happened and you start to shift it back. And in that moment, the individual understands maybe it wasn't about me.
Mhm.
I looked at this situation and I said, oh, if I hadn't have done X, Y wouldn't have happened. But now what we start to do is we start to go back and we start to look at that narration. We start to look at how that story was written. And a lot of time for example, in relationships that have those kinds of power dynamics, the abuser is working very hard to make sure you think you're the problem. So we just go in and we go, okay, what actually was the problem? So outside of that example, if as a mom I made a mistake, whatever the case may be, you know, one of the things I could say is, do we consider some of the mistakes you were going to make? Was there room for mistakes? Did your definition of motherhood allow?
Mhm.
So now we start to say, oh, maybe the problem wasn't me. Maybe the problem was I had such a narrow view of what I was supposed to accomplish. Right? So once you're able to remove the weight and shift it back, shift that responsibility back, and really re-narrate that story. Right. I don't know if you remember the books that we had in the schools where you could like choose your own ending type thing.
Yeah.
Right. So yeah, in a funny, in a less serious way, this is really what it is. It's the recognition that at any given point in time, we can hold on to whatever story we want, but our brain will only hold on to one.
Mhm.
And if we hold on to the story that says we should have done something different, it's all our fault, we should have been better, then we feel shame and we get bogged down and those roots grow and they
Mhm.
hold us there.
Yeah.
But the second most people realize they can re-narrate that story, they can pick a different ending, that's when we free ourselves from that.
I love it. That's so empowering to be able to choose your own adventure.
Yeah, absolutely. Right.
So, what role does confidence play when it comes to releasing shame and guilt?
Question. So confidence is a really interesting one because confidence is how I feel about my ability, right? Do I trust my ability? So if I'm confident in my work, do I trust my ability as a clinician, as a therapist? Do I trust my ability to help people? Right. Where I see most people struggling with confidence is they have an idea of what they're supposed to be, but that idea is not in line with what they can be. So let me qualify that. What I mean is, let's say, I'm a therapist, for example. If I come into my practice and I see my clients and I say, okay, my goal is to have an answer for everybody. As a therapist, I should know better. I don't think this way, so bear with me. But if I think, oh, I should know better, and any question that somebody asks me, I should always be able to answer, and I should always have my ducks in a row, and everything should be perfect, and I should look like I got my stuff together, right? If that is what I believe, there's some part of my brain that knows, girl, that is not the case. That is not you. That's not it. And so what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to put out this image that my brain doesn't actually hold. And that creates an internal conflict or internal chaos. And that anxiety that comes with that internal chaos makes me not be able to hold on to that identity so tightly.
Mhm.
Right. So now I'm oh God, should I go to that meeting? Should I take on that client? Oh my God, I got a new client. What are they going to think of me? Because I'm not in alignment with what it is that I feel like I want to be. Who I feel like I'm supposed to be isn't in line with how I actually see myself.
Mhm. Mhm. So, with respect to confidence, if women are working towards becoming more confident, what are potential obstacles that they might run into in that process?
Mm. The biggest obstacle, this is my personal opinion, the biggest obstacle that women run into is somebody else's definition, right?
Mm. Mhm.
Somebody else's definition of success, somebody else's definition of motherhood, somebody else's definition of what a good person is, somebody else's definition of whatever. If we don't take time and space to be able to reflect so that we can decide who and how we want to be, then we fall prey to fitting into an identity that somebody else picked for us. And I say that like it is simple, okay? And it is simple, but it's not easy. There are messages that women get every single day about who they're supposed to be, how they're supposed to look, what they're supposed to sound like, all of this weight, heavy stuff, right? So if you go on your social media, you'll see that, for the last few months, everybody's talking about a beach body and your bikini body and get ready. It's bikini season. It's like, can you swim? Sometimes success is just like, hey, I can get in the water and swim. I can have a great day with my kids on the beach. Maybe it's not about whether or not you can wear that teeny weeny bikini.
Yeah.
But if we as women don't have our own personal definitions of success, then we end up like the tree that's not firmly rooted and we're just kind of blowing in the wind, right? Somebody else you should be this, and you walk away going, God, should I? I'm not sure. Maybe I should. And that's what eats away at our confidence.
Yeah. Yeah. I think so much of this discussion around shame, guilt, bringing confidence into the mix comes down to identity,
Yeah.
culture, indoctrination through messaging
Mhm.
from childhood on, and the reinforcement of that. It's so fascinating how all that comes together. But as you've shared, there's ways that we can break through that. There is an opportunity to re-narrate the stories that we've internalized. There is an
Mhm.
opportunity there to shift and change.
Always. Yeah.
I have a final question for you.
Sure.
Resilience is a topic that is so important to women's wellness, and it's a topic that I absolutely love. What does becoming more resilient mean to you, and how does it relate to the women that you work with?
Mm. resilience for me is a major pillar of our mental health and our mental fitness. Right?
Mhm.
Resilience by definition is the ability to, take adversity and keep on going again and again and again. So it's not just once and then I get back up. Resilience is I can continue to get back up. I can experience an obstacle and still get back up. Where we may struggle with resilience is if we think it's supposed to look pretty, right? Or we think it's supposed to be a certain way. But I think as we look at resilience as women, the first thing is to say we're already pretty darn resilient, right? You don't have to say, oh, I want to build resilience. The first thing is always to look at the resilience you already have. And the way I, get my clients to do this, I do this myself, is actually write down all the adversities that you have, right? So take a timeline and however old you are, go from, 0 to 10, 10 to 20, 20 to 30, 30 to 40, and so on, and just write down the most significant experiences of adversity
Mhm.
that you've had in the past. And as soon as they're on the paper, you've got your proof that you're resilient. So we're not going to start with building resilience. We're going to start with acknowledging the resilience we already have.
Yeah.
And then from there we can say, okay, what are some of the things that eat away at my resilience? So I'm not as resilient when I'm tired and stressed and overwhelmed. Maybe I can handle my stress better. I'm not as resilient, when I'm in this relationship that I don't really feel comfortable in. Great. How can I either change the dynamics of the relationship or leave the relationship so that I can regroup with myself? Right.
Mhm.
So then from knowing we're resilient, we're building on it. And that's what also keeps shame away, right? It's not we should have handled it. We're like, no, I already got it. I'm just improving.
Yeah.
And then the last piece is really about running your own race. Where so many women struggle is when we start to compare ourselves either to the idealized version of what we think we're supposed to be, or we compare ourselves to others. And that either makes us mad at others, right? Or mad at ourselves. And we don't need to be either because you weren't put on this earth to be anybody other than you. And if you want to do something better than anybody else, be you. That's the only thing you can do better than anybody else. Not the only thing, right? But it's the most important thing.
Yeah.
So if we incorporate those ideas into how we build our resilience, right, then we have the power to conquer anything, right? Women always have.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I couldn't agree more. And I love your response. I think there's so much gold that can be mined from our past. There is an
Oh,
advantage
yeah.
to looking back and acknowledging, building from there, and looking where there might be gaps in our resourcefulness around resilience. Thank you so much,
You're
Bonnie, for
very
sharing
welcome.
your wisdom, your insights today. I have no doubt that our audience is going to benefit from hearing from you.
My absolute pleasure. Thank you so much. And thank you, Tara, for doing the work that you're doing. It's wonderful. I just love seeing women leaders and us getting out there and helping and serving our community. So kudos to you as well. And thank you so much for having me as part of your show.
Thank you. It's truly my pleasure.